Ben, you ready for a second draft?
Sure, let's go for it. Yeah, we were talking there, just to put a little bow on it as we wait for this other one to fill. We were talking there about Jaleel McLaughlin and your write up and your takeaway that like they're all sort of playable. And you mentioned Mark Ingram, and one of the thoughts that I had in going through the projections, I only projected estimate for about 20 targets. I projected McLaughlin, and I put Pirine in there for now, but I think it's either Pirine or Watson, similar roles. I projected both of them for just shy of 40 targets, and then Javonte for about 70 or 70 plus. I'm projecting overall almost like 170 running back targets, like an absolute ton. And I do think that's very defensible. But I do have Estime meaningfully below the other guys in the backfield for some of the reasons you said, that he's more of an early down option. Didn't catch a lot of passes in college, bigger back, but taking a lot of him late. I was surprised in digging into Jaleel McLaughlin while doing the projection that he got a reasonable number of targets, even though he didn't play a whole lot last year. A lot of touches per snap, because he didn't play a lot of snaps. And if the snaps role grows, he's certainly somebody that they want to get the ball to a good amount. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, but I like your conclusion of just trying to get exposure to each of them because it is just such a good situation. And yeah, McLaughlin's not my favorite way to play it, but I do like getting him, especially at an ADP discount, like you said, in the sense of like, what if I'm wrong about where the real value is here? I just don't see the fit for him in the different ways that Peyton has used running backs in the past, but it will be interesting to see. And then the way that they used him in year one as well is another key part of that, but it will be interesting to see how that comes together. What I don't want to do is not have exposure to one of the backs when I really like this situation. Like as you were talking about it, I just reiterated those thoughts to me that like, this is a situation I want to have a lot of exposure to, and bet on the team level analysis more than, being too precise about one of the specific players. Like I love the way you wrote it up. As you mentioned, I'm literally skimming through it, but all four are guys that have the potential to be really impactful pieces.
And one of the things that we're getting kind of in the heart of puff piece season is that McLaughlin is working really hard on his pass blocking. That would potentially put him on the field. One of the things that SIS had these guys charted for last year, I believe 50 pass blocking snaps for Pirine, 42 for Williams, just 3 for him. I mean, if you're not out there on some of those plays, it's harder for them to, use the misdirection. Sometimes you're involved, sometimes you're not. If you can't block, you can't go out there, your targets get knocked way down. This offense, for him to blow up, he would have to be a much bigger receiving piece. We might get that, or it might go to other guys. I mean, Javonte Williams could still be a top 5 back this year. I'm definitely not moving away from him, even though one of the things I point out in there is that, historically, when we're not sure about the number one guy, some of the other players on those teams end up with massive win rates, advance rates, what have you. Then we have the 11th pick this time, and we have 20 seconds. Garrett Wilson sadly did go just ahead of us. We're probably looking at Puka or Jahmyr Gibbs.
I think Puka's a pretty clear pick here. AJ Brown goes 109. I'm bummed that Wilson went. I'm like more excited that Brown went, and meant that one of Wilson or Puka would, like when he went off at 109, it was, to me, there's a little bit of a mini tear break there where Brown is behind it. Obviously love the talent of AJ Brown. Probably my favorite player of this generation. He's still my Twitter backdrop, which probably I should change because I kind of disparage him too much these days. We're back up. We took Puka at 111. Marvin Harrison's the ADP value. You get the correlation. I still don't really love taking him there. What do you think at this spot?
Well, I think the correlation is fun. There's no other clear-cut play. I have him ranked that way because of the correlation and because of the fun, and because if you're going to get him, you need to take him there. I don't think he's the best player here. If you have somebody else you like, I'll snag him real quick.
No, let's take Harrison. I was curious if you had somebody else that you would maybe push, whether that was getting a Jonathan Taylor share, whether that was Chris Olave, Nico Collins. There's a lot of ways we could have went. Could have pulled Jalen Warren up there, Jalen Waddle up there. He actually goes 203. One of the things about the correlation that I do think about, Sean, is that this is like very similar to the Lamb Amon Ra thing at the 1-2 turn last year, where there's just going to be so many Puka Harrison builds. And so if you don't think that Harrison's really a great value there, and also because you can get McBride so reliably at the 3-4 turn and you do like taking him, that it almost makes sense to intentionally go away from it to get somewhat unique with the Puka build. I don't know that you have to do that because last year the Lamb, Amon Ra, St. Brown thing was right. I mean, it's not to say that you have to get unique, and there are other ways you can get unique. And so having, just because it's a popular play doesn't mean it's the wrong play necessarily. But if you do think that Harrison's a little bit overpriced at that spot, like I tend to, I think we tend to, for both of us, I think there's an argument to be made that because the week 17 correlation does matter, but there's also a full season bet here. If Nico Collins is an absolute superstar this year, if Jalen Waddle is an absolute superstar this year, etc., it's if Jonathan Taylor is an absolute superstar. The week 17 element is whether that's McBride or whatever. James Conner could be the play later, right? Like something different. Essentially, I'm saying that I a Puka Waddle or Puka Nico start from a full season perspective could be massive, and it's probably underplayed relative to the Puka Harrison builds.
Exactly. And I mean, I would even argue for taking a pretty big reach, maybe reaching into the early third round, doing something fun like that. I don't think that you're getting a huge difference there. One of the reasons why you can go ahead and take Harrison is I do think that he belongs in this relatively large tier of receivers that starts with Drake London and stretches almost all the way back to our pick in round 3. If for whatever reason Harrison was even more, I mean, basically what drafters have done is said he's a fun play. We're going to value him at the very top of what is reasonable, which is after the tier break that Garrett Wilson and Puka represent. I don't think there's any world in which you would take him ahead of those guys. And yet, because there's no absolute must-have play there in round 2, there are a lot of very strong plays, and I think preferable plays. The thing that you mentioned that I think it's really important to sort of reiterate is that last year, Lamb and Amon Ra were just, such a fantastic pairing, a fantastic value. Two guys who obviously are much more expensive this year. They were the right way to play it. It would have been a mistake to get off of them simply because you're worried about other teams drafting it as well. You have 16 more picks to create the uniqueness that you need. Those two guys together, they had an insane advance rate. You just take that advance rate, you get into the tournament, and then you use the rest of your roster. Not the same thing with Puka Marvin Harrison.
Right. From a full season bet perspective, I mean, the argument I agree with you that Harrison's a part of that tier that goes very far back. The argument I consistently hear about him as well, though, is back-weighted production. It's less of a full season bet. The Lamb and Amon Ra thing, they just got so many targets over the course of the year. They were a big reason why you were there. Then the correlation was a benefit. Yeah, there's some cases where to get we talk a lot about the correlation and it matters, but like to the extent that these types of best ball tournaments are vaguely similar to DFS or other contests, like the uniqueness of ownership projections are a really meaningful element too. And as we start to see where this goes over the next however many years, being unique is going to be emphasized more, just like it was over time in DFS. Getting ahead of the game by saying like, look, this is not a correlation that I mean, we obviously went with it, but it's not one that I want to go with in a huge way, is a fine way of playing it too. We're back up here at 311. You've thrown all the guys into the queue that I would be looking at here. That tier of receiver before the George Pickens sort of drop off. Tank Dell, Zay Flowers, T. Higgins. You would put Flowers at the top there. We grab him. That makes perfect sense. To me, it's really hard to split those guys up, although Flowers certainly has the chance to be like the legit running away number one in his offense, whereas Dell, I think we both kind of believe is more of the efficiency play off of the bigger alphas probably in his pass game. Dell does go at the turn. Laporta was the other name there. He goes the turn, leaves T. Higgins. I'm totally fine with a wide receiver times 4 start.
So we'll go ahead and do that. Potentially if you take Laporta, you get one of Flowers or Dell coming back. I love to take as much Laporta as I can, but I also have enough. And it's the other thing too, where you mentioned, you can get Trey McBride at the 3-4 turn. I have so much McBride that I somewhat need to kind of force those shares into that second half element after we already had selected Marvin Harrison as well. Now, obviously, you can play them together. You can make that big Cardinals bet. But I do like going with T. Higgins there. I don't think we have the same reason to believe that he's going to be a star that we had prior to 2023. There were too many drop passes. There's too much difficulty staying healthy. They do have a couple of interesting names now in Jermaine Burton and Andre Yoshivas. But, T. Higgins is still a guy who went for basically like a 17-game stretch scoring even with Jamar Chase. Once he is pushed into early round 4, I want to have some exposure to him in this 4-receiver start where, we've already kind of taken that risk with Marvin Harrison. There's massive upside for all 4 of the receivers that we have selected. I think the upside for some of those guys, when you contrast them to a DK Metcalf, a Devontae Adams, a DJ Moore, a Michael Pittman, an Amari Cooper, even say a Tank Dell, I like the 4 names that we've got.
On Higgins, when I, again, went through the projections on these guys, I always go back to, and I just want to, I guess, plug my targets per out run series that I write in February and March. Right after the season ends, I write about all 32 teams and really focus on the pass receiving profiles. I use targets per out run as that foundational stat, but we know there's a lot of context that needs to be added to that. And I want to capture that in the write-ups right after the season has ended. And when I'm, it's all fresh in my mind and I feel good about it. And that's what I did. And so I go back and I read those. It's almost like that stuff is more valuable to me now, or this is the case that I'm making, than it was when I wrote it in March. And all that was very fresh, the little bits of context. So just, a little plug there for anyone who wants to go back and read some of the stuff over at bengretch.substack.com, the Stealing Signals newsletter. That stuff is all there on the site. For Higgins, I noted that his 18.7% targets per run was a career low last year, but only marginally, and it was at a career high 13.1 ADOT. He still showed some efficiency. It wasn't a good season by any means. It was his first year below a 1.8 yards per out run, but it was only down to 1.66. It wasn't horrible, and he also played hurt, and he had some impressive highlights at his peak during the season last year. And when I read that back, I remembered the play he made on the sideline where he goes up and he catches the ball and then turns and spins and reaches the ball back over the pylon, which was one of the more fun plays of the whole season last year. There's certainly, this higher ADOT trajectory for his targets per out run stuff is a little bit of concern when you start thinking about these big-bodied contested catch outside receivers. You want him to be earning volume in shallower ranges too. So starting to see him pigeonholed a little bit would be a problem. But I do think a lot of that had to do with the injury last year. And the fact that he still played at a decent level despite playing hurt. That was just some context that when I went back and read through it, I was like, I was more optimistic in March, right off the end of the season, about Higgins than I would have thought I was, considering I had him on a lot of teams and he wasn't very helpful to a lot of those teams. And yeah, I sometimes we just get that later bounce on the player making good, being healthier. And to your point, yeah, maybe we shouldn't think he's quite as transcendent of a player. We also don't have to pay the same price. Wide receivers have gotten more expensive, and we're now getting him in the early 4th. Last year, he was a 2-3 turn guy. And so, yeah, I really like the bet there right before, George Pickens and the drop off and the other receivers. To me, Higgins is very clearly in that group with Flowers and Tank Dell. where, 2023 could be looked back on as a little bit of an outlier. He didn't crater. He just dropped a little bit, was banged up, and then it bounces back to where it was in terms of his efficiency, in terms of the targets per out run, in terms of the overall yards per out run, to where it was each of the first 3 years of his career, where he was consistently very, very good.
And I don't think that we can really make the same claims for the upside for Joe Burrow as well. And yet some of the same basic things are true where he wasn't healthy. If we get a healthy Joe Burrow and you jump back up to them as a Super Bowl contender, again, a lot of ways for him to be ADP. We are back up. We have some interesting plays. Kyle Pitts is sort of the ADP value. I know you always like that direction. Is that your pick here?
Yeah, him or Worthy, who you have at the top of the receiving group. We did start 4 straight receivers, so I like Pitts. You moved him to the top. The guy in the turn did already have a tight end, and he only has 2 receivers. He might go receiver here. We might lose Worthy. He goes James Cook for his second running back. He does already have a tight end. Yeah, really thinking about that, I think Worthy was probably the play. If you lose Pitts, you lose Pitts, but they probably don't go Pitts there. He takes a Dunze over Worthy. So we do get Worthy to come back around. Doesn't really matter. Is that you like him there, right?
Yeah, I mean, I really like George Kittle there as well. That was one of the things that I was considering.
Well, we can do that. I'm totally fine with the 2 tight ends. We have the 4 receivers already. I don't think we have to push Worthy. I was considering that too when I said Pitts. If Worthy would have went, I would have probably said Kittle. I was thinking the same thing. Yeah, so we do go Kittle there. I think Kittle and Pitts, we can name our team like Kittle and Pitts. Kibble and Pitts.
Absolutely perfect. Absolutely perfect. Another just like very tiny considerations as we're looking at that. We already have paid a big price for Marvin Harrison. I think there is at least a mild consideration of if we want to pay up for 2 rookie receivers, in part as well, because if we had taken the 5 in the first 6 rounds, one of the paths that would be open to us will be just to go with 6 receivers. But again, then if 2 of those 6 are very young and you're maybe paying toward the upside portion of the range of outcomes as opposed to otherwise, that would be something. The other thing is that, and you can't always do this perfectly, but if I'm going to have 6 receivers, I do have a preference for at least 5 different buys. I'd love to get 6 different buys. He would have overlapped with Puka.
Let's explore that point there, because I think one of the things that people would say is in the past, we've been very willing to take as many rookies on these builds as we want. But something we did talk about, like how many rookies are you willing to take? And it was at least a consideration from the perspective of you don't expect rookies to hit as consistently all season, earn volume as consistently all season. Necessarily, they can. But I've talked about this a little bit with regards to the Harrison price, that even when Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson hit their rookie seasons, they were huge. But then they went on in their second seasons to each earn at least 2 targets per game more in their second season, because you don't just step onto an NFL field, even if you're an absolute star immediately, and earn volume the way that you will eventually for whoever you are as a peak player, or the way that the other very peak players play. And so you were talking about in this current landscape, we sort of have to pay closer to the ceiling outcome for a lot of the rookies, especially Harrison. And I think it's true of Neighbors as well. We talked about him on the first draft, and you compared him to 2 players in Cooper Kupp and Diggs that I was kind of like, I don't necessarily want to make a strong case to rank him ahead of them. I don't know where my rankings will land on that, frankly, as I get there. Because when I go through the projections, I still feel very confident that Cooper Kupp and Stephon Diggs, 2 guys that I am drafting, can have really strong seasons. And if they have a really strong season, the way that Malik Neighbors hits, kind of talked through this again in the last one, is it's different. It would be something that would be, an uncertainty. You're playing into uncertainty. There's I talked about the wide band element of it in the last show. there's the potential for a really high ceiling that we can't even really fathom what that looks like, whether that's from an efficiency standpoint, whether that is from huge volume, which Puka Nacua had last year. But in most cases, the ways that rookies hit are a little different. Our buddy Pat Carrain did some great research a couple years ago or last year maybe, where he showed that the rookie receivers that hit tend to hit more through efficiency. They tend to run fewer routes overall. We know that's in part because some of them have had their roles build up. Some of the biggest rookie hits didn't do anything in the first half of the season, right? Amon-Ra St. Brown was a massive hit down the stretch of his rookie year, did very little the first half of his rookie season. A.J. Brown, massive hit down the stretch, had a couple spike games, but wasn't playing full snaps until about week 9, week 10. Like, it's still a hit. It's still a win. And back in the day when we could get all these rookies at great prices, we would stack a lot of those types of bets together intentionally while we had some veterans in the early rounds as well. But even just a couple years ago, Jamar Chase was a 5th round pick, and he was a top 5 overall draft pick who everyone loved the profile, but he had some drops issues in camp, and suddenly he slipped into the 6th round. Marvin Harrison, a couple years later, is going at 202. It's a different conversation in terms of how much of the ceiling is baked in and what it means for your build and how many of these guys you can actually overlap. I thought that was a really interesting point, and I agree with it, that if Marvin Harrison starts slow, if he doesn't immediately command first read targets from week 1 because he's a rookie, even a really highly drafted one, a top 5 drafted one, that could be tough to be pairing with paying a premium on too many other rookies, including potentially Xavier Worthy. It doesn't mean we wouldn't do it because we were sitting there considering it heavily, almost pulled the trigger on it. But it is something I was considering as well. And I think the shape of your build is meaningful. And in this landscape where rookies are now more expensive, this is at least the way that I think about it, Sean. I'd be curious your thoughts. We're almost up here again, but after we get through these picks, at least, whether when you brought up that point about Harrison and Worthy, it really is due to the new prices, which I think it was. You mentioned the upside being built in there. Man, we lose Brian Thomas and Jackson Smith and Jig, but 2 picks ahead of us. Deontay Johnson, 4 picks ahead of us. It leaves nobody really at receiver. This is a spot, Sean, where I would at least vaguely consider Keon Coleman. Seems like you're not into that.
Yeah, especially again. This is for me is going to be Aaron Jones, but do you prefer Jonathan Brooks?
We can take Jones. I was gonna say or Jamison Williams if you like him. A 5th receiver here could have made some sense too.
Yeah, maybe we should have gone that way first because that is also the connection with George Kittle. I am trying not to reach too much for him, and we have some other things that we can do.
We grabbed Aaron Jones, and Jameson did go on the turn really quickly. Let's take. I think Brooks pairs well with Jones.
Okay, so we'll put those 2 guys together. Then one of the things that this illustrates, for me at least, again, is just how much opportunity you have to take the 6 non-running backs early when you're able to get Aaron Jones, able to get someone like Jonathan Brooks, who, as soon as he's healthy, is going to get an absolute ton of work with the Carolina Panthers. And I think work where they use him pretty effectively to maximize his scoring potential, even if the offense itself is not very dynamic. In this particular situation, we didn't have any straightforward benefit, I don't believe, to taking Coleman in terms of how we have that set up there.
Yeah, it just would have been like intentionally trying to get a 5th receiver.
Yeah, and he probably is the name there, but again, for the reasons that you mentioned, it would be hard to pass on Xavier Worthy and then take Keon Coleman. It would have been an ADP value, but not one that necessarily moves the needle. Although the second of our 2 picks was 86, which he's going at 79. The other thing that we could have done there would have been to take a Joe Burrow. Is that a consideration for you at all when confronted with the choices we had?
Yeah, he would have been an option. I didn't really think through that. It's definitely a leak that I've talked about before of mine that because I'm doing so much slow drafting and everything is in the live drafts. I just am not thinking about the quarterback position as much and like stacking it up. I just block it out of my mind and I'm like thinking about how I want to build out the different other positions. But I think, we've talked about this before. When you make the bet on Higgins, I think you're making a bet on Burrow. They're tied more so for me than even Burrow would be necessary to stack with Chase, because I think Chase can smash in a way that doesn't necessarily mean Burrow has a great year. But because I think Chase smashes in basically every situation, when I bet on Higgins, now I'm saying that Burrow has two guys smashing, and that's enough for me to then want to be on Burrow. So I do think on the Higgins teams he makes a lot of sense. Kyler had gone before we got back there. He's one that I really like to do when you do the Puka and Marvin Harrison thing. I mean, I like getting some exposure to Aaron Jones. I'm not taking a ton of him or anything, but I do like getting some of him, and I don't have enough of him. And this is a team where he makes some sense. We talked about James Conner in the last draft as well, Sean. He goes a couple picks after our Jonathan Brooks pick. He could have been one, again, to build out that Arizona Rams thing some more. Maybe we wound up with a Stafford team here. But Aaron Jones, Jonathan Brooks, I agree. I mean, that's the exact example of why early running back is tricky. Those guys can score, can give you, and when you think about like the concepts of like a Frankenstein running back build, like we've talked about in the past years, where, you know, in these best ball tournaments, you're most talking about, can you get the 25-point games from somewhere in your running back build and then also have enough floor throughout. Aaron Jones and Jonathan Brooks, I feel fairly confident, are both going to pepper in a couple spike games into our running back build. Now, ideally, we'll be able to build out some more, like maybe they're both not reliable for the full 17 games, and that would be, I think, part of why their price is what it is. But if we're able to be right with some floor stuff in addition to that, it's not going to be too difficult. And I don't even know that we have to swing at floor, but I'm just saying, like, that's an easy way for people to think through it. Now you've replicated some of the middling but good full season running back lines that you have to pay a lot more money for, because that's what they end up being. That's what a really good season for a fourth or fifth round running back often looks like, is a few 25-point games and a lot of consistency in the 10 to 15-point range. But we can build that out in a zero RB way. We can build that same scoring line out. So anyway, I think Aaron Jones and Jonathan Brooks fit together very well as well, from the, obviously, Brooks being more of a late scorer, Jones being more of an early scorer.
Then we got really close to Cortland Sutton coming all the way back way below ADP, which would have been a fun play to put with T. Higgins. That doesn't happen. To me, this looks like Tyjae Spears. Are you seeing a different path?
Him or Chase Brown? You recently made the case that Brown should go straight ahead of Spears, but do you want to try to get them both?
Yeah, I think with Chase Brown, we'd be taking him around ahead of ADP, even at the second pick. So let's kind of look to that here. The only other consideration now, this would be the range that we take Brock Purdy, but I do think we have some other quarterback options available. Do you prefer Purdy or do you prefer Chase Brown?
Either's fine. I don't have a strong take here. I mean, I think I'm worried about receiver with only the 4. Yeah, I was looking. You just hovered over at 80 Mitchell. I was kind of looking at him and then thinking through. We didn't really have enough time, but I was thinking through, well, what if we backdoor a Wandale Daniel Jones thing, and then we had 80 Mitchell into this build. We'll have other options to add receivers. I don't think he had to be the guy to take there.
Yeah, Mitchell has that week 14 bye. We already have Flowers with 14. If we want those Broncos guys to go with the Bengals and then to give us another QB option, they would be week 14. That would maybe get us a little bit too heavy with that.
I hadn't thought through that, but I like that. This should be a Bo Nix, Marvin Mims type of build at this point. When we did take Chase Brown there. We didn't take Purdy. The only thing we had tied to Purdy was Kittle. We didn't get Jameson Williams. We're not going to have, I mean, I think Khalif Raymond's vaguely draftable at the very end, Sean, but I doubt I'm going to talk you into him. But we're not going to have probably a Detroit Lion in this build. So Purdy wasn't like super appealing to me. I think it's just playing Kittle is fine. But yeah, when we take Chase Brown with Higgins now, building out our late, like Denver's the most fun way to build out anything late anyway. So it's a really good team to do that, get the week 17 correlation built in. So definitely one where Mims, Franklin is obviously the other guy that you can do it with. Having both of those two as options, and then Knicks being a pretty reliably cheap late quarterback is nice. Purdy does go as we head back the other direction. We still have multiple outs, stacking outs. We could do Kirk Cousins with Pitts. We could do Stafford with Puka, where we have the Harrison bring back. I guess that's it.
And I would say that one of the things that made me really pause with letting Purdy go is that when we have George Kittle, I do think, I would make that same, probably just narrative kind of scenario thought with him that you mentioned with T. Higgins, where especially when you're thinking of the fantasy playoffs, when George Kittle scores a 40-yard touchdown, I mean, Brock Purdy's probably going to have a spike week for you that week in the playoffs. I think that part of it is nice. But, I mean, the great thing about doing this Puka Marvin Harrison start when you then take Kyle Pitts is that I think there is a pretty strong argument for Kirk Cousins and Matthew Stafford being guys who, as you're trying to kind of work that path through the tournament, how do you sort of offset those weeks? Who could go off for a 4-touchdown passing game? How would it be related to the players you have on your roster? Once I've opened those guys up, I do like to get a little bit of them because I think otherwise, you just end up probably underweight on two players who they don't have that hybrid element, but because their passing attacks could be so dynamic, if you end up pretty underweight on them at the price that they have, which is just so favorable, I think that probably ends up being a mistake.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. What now that we don't have Purdy, what do you like quarterback wise? I mean, Cousins and Stafford are two you have in the queue right now. We're hoping to look at later. This is not the spot to be taking them necessarily. The next thing
it is awkward because they both have ADPs that are in that gap. It's one of the other additional problems of having the 11th pick.
Yeah. It's like you could reach on them, probably shouldn't, but also at times you're like, I mean, I'm doing a 0 QB build and I don't have anything stacked up, and not 0 QB, but just whatever, late round QB. And I'd kind of like to at least have one of those things built out.
And so we'll come across some interesting choices here where maybe there isn't anything that is must draft. Now, we did get Judy to come back to us. He is at a discount. We only have the 4 receivers. That would be a consideration. Marshawn Lloyd, I think, is interesting here. Anybody else that we should be looking at?
No, I think Judy makes a lot of sense in a 4 receiver build to this point. We really need to add some receiver depth, and he's somebody that you and I have talked about as probably belonging inside the wide receiver window, who's going comfortably outside of it. It's just a really nice value at 11-11 on him. It does theoretically open up another QB path that we're not going to want to go down. But I mentioned it on the last stream as well. We could potentially take Deshaun Watson as well. I think it makes me want to push Cousins and Stafford more and get Lloyd as well, or get, something else at receiver. You could go like Leggett or something.
So in terms of looking at the other teams, Stafford is not going to come back. I think the Cousins will.
Then let's take Stafford. We have the bring back on that already. Do you want to take him?
I was going to say we can pass him and just not worry about that part. We can take Marshawn Lloyd. Marshawn Lloyd, I think, would have been a good fit. I do think that if we end up with Stafford and Cousins and then potentially Bo Nix, that's
a good.
The quarterbacks are going to be strong.
Yeah, that was a tricky one where we got low on the clock. I would have also so we both would have preferred to go Lloyd there, but like with 5 seconds left, you were like, Stafford's not going to come back. It's like, okay, well then let's go Stafford if that's what you want to do.
Well, the reason I say that is that the Cooper Kupp team did not have a QB and did have it somewhat clearly set up to take him probably in round 13. That doesn't mean we had to take him. I just wanted to, you didn't have access to this other part of the board. I wanted to throw that information in.
No, I appreciate that. And I think that's a good point as well. When you're on the turn, one of the tricky things is like, so I assume the cup drafter, he went in like in the third, right, is like near us. So, okay, he doesn't take Stafford here. We just took Stafford well above ADP. But if Stafford does get all the way back around towards us, the cup drafter is in the couple picks right before us. And I do think that's a really important thing to consider when you're trying to figure out if a guy's going to fall or not. Like, I need this guy to fall 22 picks. And the guy that's the biggest threat, or the other drafter that's the biggest threat to take him, is like 20 picks away. And so if he does start to fall and looks like he's going to make it back to me, that guy's going to see the same thing at that point and then take him. So I think you're probably absolutely right. And I didn't mind reaching on a QB there and then trying to pass the other one. And if we get a discount on the other one, then we can take them both. I didn't want to overpay for both. It was tricky to try to pass both. So, I mean, I was definitely okay with this path too. I think with the Judy pick opening up the potential for a Deshaun Watson pick as well, which, I would have probably went Lloyd because I think he's a pretty impactful RB5 in this build. And then it gives us 3 quarterbacks that could come back to us.
Yeah. Those are good points. If we pass them both and they both go in the interim, and again, I'm suggesting that Cousins won't go because we actually have the Drake London drafter blocked. That certainly is not a complete guarantee that someone else will not take him, around or, after ADP. He's got to go 8 slots behind to get all the way to us. So, if you lose out on both guys, the other drafter here is this team that otherwise had it set up for a Will Levis, a Baker Mayfield. I'm guessing that, in this pick here is where they would have liked to have had Stafford. So it's not like just those other 2 guys.
Sure. Looks like they're going to maybe go like, did they take Jefferson in the first round? At 104?
Jamar Chase.
Oh, Chase.
Chase Evans cut. Yeah.
They just took back-to-back Packers and then took a Viking. So I thought they were kind of building that game out. They can't get love. Maybe they were going towards like a JJ McCarthy thing, but probably not. It'll be interesting to see how that team finishes. So Cousins hasn't gone. Since we took Stafford, Herbert and Rodgers went. Marshawn Lloyd went a couple picks after our Stafford pick. In terms of passing up Lloyd, we do already have 4 running backs: Aaron Jones, Jonathan Brooks, Tyjae Spears, and Chase Brown. It's a pretty strong build already at running back. You don't have to get the RB5. Deshaun Watson does go here on the way back, so he's certainly not an option. We're a couple picks away from Cousins. The guy on the clock now already has 2 QBs. There's one more who only has 1. Could be a threat to take Cousins. Not a huge threat necessarily.
So McLaughlin goes, Chubb goes.
Jalen Wright feels like a fun pick on this team as like a pretty pure handcuff, but where we already have 4 other guys that we think are going to be sort of involved, and he kind of just adds ceiling. Oh, he went. Fun.
He does go. One of the things I was really wanting to say that if we had Marshawn Lloyd, you could argue that even against teams that are taking running backs in the first 5 rounds, that we have the most explosive running back group you can get with Aaron Jones, still a vastly undervalued talent, a Jonathan Brooks, a Tyjae Spears. He's electric. Chase Brown, one of the fastest players in the NFL. You get Marshawn Lloyd. I mean, he's far more dynamic than his running mate. We just have the 4 guys as it is. Then Quentin Johnston comes back to us. You can always take a little bit of the value there. The other running back would probably be Vital. This is probably ahead of where we need to take Troy Franklin, but you can always go ahead and make that pick. Do you have a name that you
Probably Vital over Quentin Johnston, because I think we're going to go receiver on the next turn with the Denver guys, assuming they come back.
And so we are still
both
only
of
up to
them.
5 receivers.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I wanted to keep open the possibility that if Franklin and Mims both made it back, we could take both and get up to 7 receivers and set up a Denver double stack. Vital was our 5th running back to pair with our 5 receivers. We could have went Quentin Johnston there. Maybe that was a mistake. But I think we could be more or less done at running back now with the 5, unless you really want to add one. We could add a 6th. Wandale Robinson goes 1 pick behind that. You had just started him with like 5 seconds left on the clock, but he would have been a reasonable add there as another solid upside receiver. We do need receivers. It's not great to only have 5 through 14 picks.
Yeah, I think that we have to count on the fact that we went wide receiver times 4 to start to help carry us to an extent, but we will be continuing to look at some other names. One of the things I was going to mention there, and it did happen in the interim, if Darnell Mooney had come back 2 more spots, is he someone that you would have wanted to add to this particular team?
Not necessarily like wanted to add, but I've drafted Mooney a few times because of the stuff that we've talked about with the way that the Rams play, and Zach Robinson coming over from Los Angeles, from the Rams to the Falcons to take over their offense. And my expectation that they will probably be pretty concentrated in their routes and their snaps and those things. I think Mooney probably stays on the field quite a bit in Atlanta. And then another one where, I referenced the targets per out run pieces a little bit ago, and I'll say it again, like, people who are interested in my take on this stuff should go back and read that stuff. I went back and read the Mooney stuff when I did the Atlanta projection, and my notes on Mooney talked through how he had a very low targets per out run last year, like 11%. Some of that is because of Justin Fields, the scramble rate, the sack rate, the fact that Mooney's routes are longer developing down the field. DJ Moore was a quick hitter, more of a quick hitting option is the way I should say that.
I think he would stick with quicker hitter.
But also that Mooney's other 3 seasons were all pretty good, and his rates out of college, out of Tulane, were good. His targets per hour, his ability to earn volume at a higher ADOT isn't nothing. And the way that I wrote it in that targets per out run piece, I think it was in the Bears section, was that the 2023 11.8% was the clear outlier. That his other 3 years, 17.9% targets per route as a rookie who ran 500 plus routes at a higher above average ADOT. And then as a sophomore, 21.9%. And then in 2022 as a third year player, 18.6%, and had dropped a little bit, but it was his career high ADOT. And then last year just cratered, absolutely cratered. It looks like last year's the kind of the clear outlier season. And then he goes to a new offense. Does he have talent? I think so. I think the profile, the 4-year profile, suggests that he's not a bad player, a player who can't earn volume. And if they're going to concentrate the routes and the playing time in Atlanta, a la the Rams, because they're, a new coaching staff coming over from the Rams, I think Mooney has the potential to be a worthwhile, routes eating, spike week adding because of the high ADOT, piece to these types of builds. You're obviously referencing the fact that we already had a Cousins Pitts thing. Like, doesn't make sense to add Mooney. And I think, yeah, it does.
So we're coming back through here. We are 1 pick away now from getting our preferred selection of Marvin Mims. I do like taking Devontae Walker on as many teams as possible. He's not as good a fit here with the current build. I don't think there's anything we're looking at other than Mims for this pick. Would that be accurate?
No, I don't think there's much. I mean, I could talk you into Mims. Mims needed to be the pick there because we need to set up Bo Nix. But I could start to talk you into Demarcus Robinson for some of the reasons that I was just saying with the heavy routes usage for the Rams. Because we do
So
have Stafford and Puka on this team, right? We took Stafford,
we did.
and
So we
then
have those two guys, and we have the Cardinals off of them.
yeah. I mean, I take Robinson, especially on a build like this where I don't feel like I'm really deep in upside profiles, but I think he's going to run a lot of routes. They paid him like $4 million to bring him back this offseason, a 1-year deal, but he took over Tutu Atwell's role in 3 receiver sets. He's a good run blocker. That's why they played him. He scored some touchdowns, had some solid production out of those solid routes rolls. And then they went out this offseason and paid him the best deal that Demarcus Robinson was probably going to be able to get, right? Like a 1-year, $4 million deal. It's like basically all guaranteed to come back and play that same role as the way that I'm reading it. So I think he's going to run plenty of routes, and I think he's not going to have like huge spike weeks, but in best ball, he's going to give you some usable weeks, is the term, which isn't, I know, your favorite way of playing best ball, but we did take him. I convinced you to take a very boring player.
Well, you did a nice job, and that you definitely talked through a decent chunk of the next round. There was no way for me to jump in and ask
You wanted to go to Jermaine Burton at the last second. I saw that.
Well, I was thinking if we're going to play those Bengals guys off of Bo Nix, but and Burton is now, I don't know, what is it, like 30 picks below ADP, but frankly his ADP makes no sense, and it's going to crater again in all likelihood. Then one of the fun picks that Pete and I were able to make this week was Yoshivas in the final round. I guess I'm kind of leaning to him as being the third receiver for the Bengals.
He was very good last year. When I went through the projections there, I mean, I tend to defer a little bit to like market expectations and those things. I think Trenton Irwin is also a little bit of a threat. He played a decent amount before Yoshivas, and I think they like him, scheme knowledge, etc. In terms of who's going to take the Boyd role, I do think it's up in the air. I didn't have any of them with more. I gave Burton 51 targets, which is not a lot for a guy who's going in this range, obviously. I gave Irwin 43. I only gave Yoshivas 19. But I essentially had the same take as you, that it's not clear. And, not the same take, because you're talking about Yoshivas. I think it's maybe Irwin that threatens more. But we'll both scenarios in terms of how you wind up playing it. It's like, yeah, it's kind of tough to play the Bengals beyond T. Higgins, unless you want to go to the tight ends. By comparison, Sean, I projected Demarcus Robinson for 86 targets and felt good about it.
I'm glad you felt good about it. That is, I mean, we got a nice value on him. He does work here well. I think when you take Matthew Stafford as opposed to just Puka, then you get more excited about it when you have Marvin Harrison. And we're talking about how you get through the tournament. Ben, one of the things that does happen is that frustratingly bad players do occasionally have a very important spike week. Well, I won't go into the Amari Cooper thing. There is also an element where Robinson could be a little bit of a smoother for us in terms of the weekly scoring, especially with this team in the weeks that Puka doesn't go off. I mean, it's more likely to be Cooper Kupp. Maybe they go off together. Maybe Matthew Stafford is a huge win for us. I really like having, but I don't necessarily think we have to take Nix. I really like Stafford and Cousins here together, but since we have it set up nicely, I think Nix is a nice play. I think Jalen Tolbert is an interesting play for the reasons we talked about in the last show with the CD Lamb selection and how they have nobody there. He also gives us that week 7 bye that is otherwise hard to get to. That balances out a little bit. I also think that.
What do you think about Ryan Flournoy?
Well, I will point out that I do think he went to Southeast Missouri State. You're always kind of floating Southwest Missouri State. I think they've dropped that part and it's just Missouri State. I'm
sorry. I know you're from those parts. I'm I'm a coastal elite that keeps messing up the Missouri colleges.
Bo Nix right here.
Let's take Knicks here. Yeah, in terms of, I like the Tolbert point and I like the buy, but I'm totally fine taking Tolbert. I'm just curious if you consider Flournoy over Tolbert straight up at any point because he's more of a unknown essentially.
Probably not yet, but I would not be surprised if what you're saying right now ends up being something that we have to consider in a month, right? I mean, that would be a fun development. I put a Gesicki in. One of the things I always want to keep mentioning is that 3 tight end, even with the elite tight end, does kind of show, but it's an overlap with Pitts on the bye. I think this is Tolbert for me. Do you see anybody else?
No, we already have Harrison, so I can't really talk you into Greg Dortch. So we might as well go with Tolbert. A little bit more ceiling there. I already made you take DeMarcus Robinson on this team. I can't, in good conscience, also make you take Greg Dortch.
Well, you bring that up. So it is a kind of a fun little discussion to finish out the show with. How should fantasy managers be looking at these depth pieces for the Arizona Cardinals? I mean, he's somebody who, I mean, Blair wrote a glowing review of him coming out as a prospect. And
Yeah.
we have watched him have some occasional good games, especially when everybody is hurt. I'm not a huge
Right.
believer in Michael Wilson, but I do think that he probably is a red zone threat. I guess I think Zay Jones is actually a good football player. You put him on a
Yeah.
team where if they need some other players, uh, basically, I don't think it's very clear. And I mean, Zay Jones is an athlete, right? And when he wasn't hurt in 2022, is he the person that we should be looking at?
My concern with him is he's the latest addition, right? Although he got multiple workouts after Jacksonville cut him, and it seems odd to me that he would land in a place where he doesn't get any playing time. Like you'd think that would be part of the conversation to some degree, no guarantees or anything, but to some degree that there's an opportunity there. Because I know he also worked out with Dallas, and we just got done talking about how like Dallas could have used Zay Jones, right? Like Zay Jones would have been very draftable if he would have went and signed with Dallas. The Greg Dortch comment for me does come down to roles and thinking, okay, you have McBride at tight end, you have Marvin Harrison in a traditional sort of whatever X role, and then Michael Wilson and Zay Jones to me kind of feel like an overlapping the other outside receiver high A dot role. And Greg Dortch to me seems like the closer to the line of scrimmage slot receiver, maybe motion man, Rondell Moore replacement role. Although they didn't do a lot with Rondell Moore last year, his manufactured touches, all that stuff really cratered in this new offense relative to what he was getting in his first couple of years in Arizona. But I do think Dortch, like you said, when everyone else has been out, I mean, his profile is so fascinating because you look at it and his like targets per out run and all that stuff isn't actually that strong. But then you go look at his career and you look at his game logs, and he has a bunch of games where he's played some but not really gotten the ball at all. And then he has 4 10+ target games, 2 more 9 target games, an 8 target game, a 7 target game, and then no 6 target games, 1 5 target game, and then everything else is 4 or lower. But he has this group of games where he's had, and it's not a small number. I mean, like however, wherever you want to draw that cutoff, 7 games where he's had 8 or more targets, or 4 games where he's had 10 or more targets. In 3 of those games, he caught 9+ balls. Like he's really consolidated volume at times in these situations where the team has needed help. It's not really been particularly effective. One of the things I'm noticing is in all these games where he had 8 or more targets, they lost every single game for Arizona over the last couple of years. 7-0-7 in those games where Greg Dortch has got meaningful volume. But he does have some production in college, as you talked about, and Blair really liked him. I keep hearing good things about what he was as a prospect. And then when we have seen him need to be featured, he's been productive enough. And then you keep hearing stuff like Kyler Murray coming out and saying, if he was 6'4", he'd be a top 5 receiver in the NFL because he's completely unguardable and all this stuff. Kyler Murray seems to absolutely love Greg Dortch. I don't know that he's like a stud, but as a last round pick relative to Zay and Michael Wilson, who both go earlier, and I think might be kind of competing for the same role in some ways and might be a little bit rotational. Obviously, they can move Marvin Harrison inside. They can do all sorts of different things, right? And they can get Michael Wilson and Zay Jones on the field together. They can move Zay inside. They can, like, all these guys can, modern NFL, a lot of these guys can move around, but um it's definitely not a guarantee that Dortch would be out there is what I'm getting at, but it just seems from a role perspective like he will play a decent amount and has a little bit more of a path to clear routes to me than Zay Jones and Michael Wilson, where those guys could just not even really be playing a ton, and that's kind of the concern. I don't know. What do you like Zay? You were saying. I want to hear
I
the case there.
I do. I think that what you pointed out in terms of if you're the last guy in and the quarterback actually does have a bit of rapport with the other players, then that is meaningful. In terms of reading about why he signed there, what they think he can do, I mean, they've talked about him as being a receiver who can do everything and that he's a matchup nightmare because of his size, speed, profile when you can do everything. And then you look back to, just 2022, which isn't, like 5, 6 years ago, just the year before last, where he runs 527 routes by SIS. Only 25 receivers had at least that many. And a big chunk of the receivers that ran that many routes were well below his 23% targets per route. Now, Ben, I think in your numbers, he's probably a little bit lower than that based on how PFF does it in contrast. But to have that many routes and that, relatively strong an ability to generate targets. And I think, when you're in an offense where they did have some other guys, I guess he seems like a bigger talent than some of the other players. And I think it's maybe a long-winded way to work back around to, I guess I kind of think it's going to be split, in which case, if you're talking about last round picks in best ball, that could still work out. But I expect that to be a group that cannibalizes behind Harrison and McBride.
It does still look solid in my numbers, for sure. And I like that point. I mean, if they do kind of cannibalize it, you just want to bet on the talent. I think Zay's a fun bet. You can also go all the way back to, it's a long, long time ago now, but he did have the monster record breaking collegiate season. I plugged that in just now. His targets per out run is an absurd 36.7%, 216 targets that year. 216 targets.
Yeah, he can definitely get open for you underneath if that's exclusively where you want to throw the ball. So it will be interesting. Ben, we've come to the end of a couple of drafts here. It was a great way to sort of wrap up a vacation week for you. At least it was for me. Hopefully it was for you as well. You're recording it in the air conditioning, which is at least something.
Yeah. Yeah, it was quite hot the last few days. The family got a little bit burnt out. The kids weren't sleeping real well. We are back home. I'm kind of yawning through the show. I apologize to anyone who heard that. We did a couple of drafts, so we at least got something out this week. But yeah, I am still on lake time a little bit here, so it's a good wrapping up point.
So our team, Matthew Stafford, Kirk Cousins, Bo Nix at quarterback. I love how that group complements each other. The explosiveness we discussed with those first four running backs, Aaron Jones, Jonathan Brooks, Tyjae Spears, Chase Brown, Kamani Vidal. Ben, this could be an extremely low-scoring running back group, or it could be one of the best in the entire contest. I love having that extraordinarily wide range of outcomes for the group. I'm betting on the talent. We're betting on the talent. We like those players. Puka, Marvin Harrison, Zay Flowers, T. Higgins, Jerry Jeudy, Marvin Mims, Demarcus Robinson, and Jalen Tolbert at receiver. To be able to put together a roster here where we go wide receiver ×4 to start and still end up with 8 and like our other positions, that's the key thing. You still have to like your other positions. That part of it is a lot of fun. And then Kyle Pitts, George Kittle. What was your catchphrase for them again? Because I think these two players are going to absolutely smash every other tight end group in the league. If they don't, we've made a big mistake.
Well, you got the dog food, kibbles and bits, right? So we have Kittle and Pitts.
Very nice. Very nice. Well, that'll do it for today's. We'll call it a special episode. Special episodes are always fun of Stealing Bananas. I'm Shawn Siegele. With me, as always, is Ben Gretch. You can follow at Yards Per Gretch, at Stealing Signals, at Stealing Lines. Going to have some really cool YouTube shows for you very shortly where he'll be discussing his slow draft underdog picks on the clock, some interactive elements to that. You won't want to miss it. And as he noted, some really cool targets per route run pieces that you put that together with the projection articles he's going to have out, you'll be completely set to do your drafts this fall. We'd love to have you join us over at RotoViz, coupon code RVRadio 2024 at checkout. If anything intrigued you about me writing way too many words about the Denver Broncos running backs, that would be of interest to you. Probably more Michael Dubner, Jake Bowes, Kevin, Matt, Irby, fantastic articles they have had out. Make sure you check us out there. Leave us a rating and review. Those help us with the algorithm. We love you guys. We'll talk to you soon.